All right, we're going to be starting off this session with Peter Gloor's paper. Peter is from MIT for the Center for Collective Intelligence. Peter has done a lot of work with Twitter and a lot of different social media. He's going to be delivering a paper called Measuring Creative Performance of Teams Through Dynamic Semantic Social Network Analysis. So, Peter?
So I would like to describe some projects which we have been doing for the last 12 years, studying communication between people through analyzing email archives. That's how it started. Then we looked at blogs, Twitter, Wikipedia, and Facebook. And we are also using something called sociometric badges, which we put around the necks of people, and then we look how they speak to each other, whether they look into each other's eyes while they speak, whether they take turns, how close they are, what are their energy levels. The basic idea is that we are all a product of our relationships that can be measured through those dynamic communication patterns. And the pattern that interests me most is the pattern of creativity. How are new ideas being created? And for that, I have developed a framework, or I have coined a framework around the concept of coins, collaborative innovation networks. And it's based on the premise that we can have many smart people, but ideas will only stick if a smart person is able to recruit others to work with them and turn a crazy vision into a product. And that's what the coin framework really does. And in my talk in the next 40 minutes or so, I will give you a background of the coin framework. I will describe some previous work that motivates my current insights with projects from the global to the local level, and certainly I will introduce the 3+5 rule, which means the 3 basic rules of how we have to collaborate to be more productive innovators. And in particular, we have distilled 5 variables that we extract from email, from Twitter, or from sociometric badges that measure how creative an individual and a group really is. So let me start with describing how this coin framework, the collaborative innovation networks, really works. And I would like to illustrate that by a personal example. I came to MIT very, very long time ago. And I worked at the CSAIL at that time, Computer Science II Lab. It was called LCS, Lab for Computer Science at that time, as a postdoc from Switzerland. And I was writing a paper about a system called CyberMap, which I'm proud to tell was accepted at the ACM Hypertext Conference in San Antonio. So I packed up my big clunky Macintosh at that time, dragged it to San Antonio to demo my system, and then I met this gentleman there. Anybody knows who that is? Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the World Wide Web. At that time, nobody knew who he was. And by the way, he has a little bit less hair now than on that picture. But he came to me and he told me that he had submitted a paper about a system called the World Wide Web, which unfortunately was not accepted at the conference because the program committee thought the system had 0 academic value and would never succeed. He didn't care. He just went there anyway. He had brought a big pile of his papers because it was not in the proceedings, but he brought them anyway. And he asked me, because obviously I'm not born in this country from my accent, I'm Swiss, and he was working in CERN, so homophily. One Swiss guy, actually he's a British guy, but he worked in a Swiss institution, helps another one, so I was happy to oblige. he put up the papers at my desk, and he organized the Birds of a Feather session during lunchtime. He was able to get a little group of people together to help him turn his crazy idea, the World Wide Web, into a product. And that's what I call the collaborative innovation network. This little intrinsically motivated group, applying Dunbar's rule, 3 to 15 people, that without pay but highly committed, turn the idea into a product. He tried to recruit me too. I had better things to do. I needed to work on my academic career and not on a non-academically viable system. But he got a few other postdocs and graduate students. And a little bit later, my boss at MIT at that time, David Clark, who was the head of the Internet Engineering Task Force at that time, and he did TCP/IP and SNMP and those sort of things. He was smarter than me. He invited Tim to come to MIT. Tim didn't get an office. He only got a desk in the hallway, a very old, clunky computer. He didn't care. He came there anyway, and he started sending out a lot of email and recruiting others to his system. And that's the next level of the COIN framework. That's the collaborative learning network. The bigger group of people, friends and family, again Dunbar's number, plus minus 150, that try out the product of the labor of love of the COIN. In this case, the World Wide Web Consortium took over, and Tim used another of my rules, which is that it's better to be a little fish in a big pond than a big fish in a little pond. So leveraging the brand of MIT was able to get funding for the World Wide Web Consortium. And when he organized the first World Wide Web conference in Geneva, it became obvious even to me that it was a good idea. I wanted to go there, but it was too late. It was heavily oversubscribed, and that means we are at the fourth stage of collaborative innovation networks, and that's when the rest of the world recognizes how cool an idea the product of the COIN is. And this four-step process, from the COIN to the learning network to the interest network, that's what we are trying to understand, measure, model, optimize through social network analysis. On the little small team level with the badges, on the organizational level through email, and on the global level by looking how Occupy Wall Street is being tweeted. And I would like to describe today one particular project, which is the C3N project at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, which Ron Bird is also involved in that one. He's doing quote-unquote old-fashioned social network analysis. We are doing the email social network analysis, and my particular role is help to create new COINs. And I was learning about some papers that I wasn't even aware that come out of that group. That means the COIN there is already in it's in the interest level. It's global by now. The goal of the C3N network is to better the lives of patients of Crohn's disease, which probably all of you have heard of. It's unfortunately a chronic illness which has really been growing very quickly in the US and the Western world. It's quite intrusive, meaning that if you have inflammatory bowel disease, it changes your life. You cannot eat anymore as you like. You have to spend long periods of your day at the bathroom, and you have to take very heavy drugs or do some surgery. And the idea of COINs, or as here it's called the collaborative care networks for Crohn's, is that combining patients, and patients are 12 to 25-year-olds in the beginnings of Crohn's, doctors, caregivers, meaning parents, and researchers into groups of peers to develop solutions for better the lives of Crohn's through the mechanism of COINs. should come up with new solutions that would be impossible otherwise. That's the idea. And what you see here is some new solutions that have been developed by the coins emerging from this initiative. We also had a team BernersLee, actually it was two in this case, it was Peter Margolis and Michael Seid, and they started this C3N project 3-4 years ago. And then you see here a few World Wide Web like innovations, like coming up with some mobile games for, at the same time, collecting data about Crohn's and also helping patients, the 12 to 20-year-olds, to connect. And so all of those things that you see around here are new ideas that have been turned into prototypes and addressing Crohn's disease. We have been collecting the email of this project from the beginning, and here you see also some of our principles that have come out of these 12 years of research that help create coins and make them more effective. The first one is that you need central leaders. It turns out even those self-organizing open source like networks, Wikipedia has Jimmy Wales, the web had or still has Tim Berners-Lee's, Linux has Linus Torvalds, but also commercial undertakings like Google, Facebook, and so on, you always have a central leader. So you might think that in coins it's very egalitarian, but the point is that's not true. However, there are some things that set those central leaders apart, and that's rotating leaders. So that means whenever Linus realizes there is somebody else who can do the task in a better way, he will delegate. And this is supported by very solid research, also in industry, by some of my colleagues at Sloan, where the more you see rotation in leadership, the higher the quality of the end product. And so that's something that we can very easily measure in terms of social network analysis. So here we are tracking that, and what you see here is the email archive of Peter Margolis, Michael Seid, and 5 to 10 other key members of the C3N project, collected over the last 3-4 years, and then loaded into the tool that we have been developing for the last 10 years called Condor by now. It has gone through different cycles. It was called TechFlow a long time ago, but now it's called Condor, and it creates movies of social networks from sociometric badges, email, Twitter, and so on, and also analyzes the content, which allows us to look how happy or unhappy people are and what's the word usage. And we are heavy users of the insight, for example, of Mr. Pennebaker from UT Austin. I don't know whether some of you are familiar with his work. That's also gives us other variables of what sort of communication is the best for what type of desired outcome. It actually turns out that those 5 variables, which I will describe later on, sometimes for certain types of tasks, the higher they are, the better. For others, it's the opposite. So for example, the rotating leadership, the more in a creativity task leaders take turn, the better. But we have also analyzed nurses in a very big Boston area hospital, whose name we are not allowed to mention. And we have also looked at call centers, and there it's the opposite. The steadier the leadership, if it's always the same boss, that's better for those sort of operational tasks. Same for sentiment. We have found that if you're in a creativity task, if you have happy and positive people, that's good. We also looked at sales teams, and what we found there is that customers trust salespeople that use less upbeat language, that do not just spam their communication with great, wonderful, cool, the greatest, and so on, the less they use that language, the happier their customers are. So again, same variable, but depending on the application, opposite insights. So in this project, as you can see from the background of my slides, I get very inspired from the bees. And that's not just because my father had lots of bees, which he did. As a kid, I wasn't happy because we got stung all the time. But because they are such great role models of self-organizing swarms. And I call my framework swarm creativity, and the mechanism for recruiting new members. What Tim Berners-Lee did when he came to San Antonio, recruiting others to help him develop the word I call the waggle dance. Because the bees, they do the waggle dance. I don't know whether you're familiar with the waggle dance. That's their language. So they can communicate honey sources, and they also communicate locations when bees are swarming and they need to tell where to go. They use the waggle dance. And the nice thing is that with social networks and using email patterns, we can see the waggle dance of people like Tim Berners-Lee, Jimmy Wales, and so on, very nicely. So that's step number 3. And then the bees, they do another thing. They make the destination attractive by spreading attraction pheromone, and people do the same. And so those 4 steps we can measure very nicely, and I will illustrate that by the example of the 5 variables. And what you see here is the waggle dance of bees. And the question now is, so there is one bee, and you see how she is waggling, and that means this is a very predictable pattern. And the question is, does Tim Berners-Lee have a very predictable pattern too? And the answer is yes. And there is 3 dimensions to that pattern. The first one is the social network pattern, where we just look at how embedded, how many strong and weak ties somebody has. What I like to say is that weak ties are good for spreading ideas, strong ties are good for adaptation of ideas, meaning if you need the strong ties too to convince others to adopt your ideas. And so that's step number 1. Step number 2, speed of response. And it helps to think of yourself sending an email to Bill Gates. Doesn't mean anything. Everybody can send an email to Bill Gates, but if he responds to you 30 seconds later, you must be really important. And it turns out all of us have that behavior. The faster we respond to somebody, the higher we think of that person. And Condor has by now, we call it a virtual mirror. All of those variables will tell you what others think about you, and you can look at who responds to you the fastest. Just loading your mailbox into Condor, and the people that respond to you the fastest, they like you the best. And you can also do that for yourself and look at whom you respond the fastest. And you might get some surprises, because it might not be the people that you think that are the ones that you respond the fastest. We have looked at entire departments. By now we got probably email from 100 or so organizations. And right now, it took a very long time, 12 years. And we went through some major crises, because email is a highly confidential media, and originally people are very reluctant to give us the data, but by now we have learned how we have to do it. And the key thing is that we aggregate information, and we will never give back to the boss information about the individual. We only give back aggregated information, and we will give back individual information to the individual, if they want. It's their choice. And applying that principle, it works very well. And for example, we looked at a few hundred people consulting organizations, and we compared speed of response with happiness, satisfaction inside their departments. And we found in one organization that happy departments, it took them less than a day on average to answer email, and unhappy departments, it took 3 days. So just looking at speed of response is a great predictor of all sorts of things. And the third thing that we look at is content. And this has two aspects. One is the hidden life of pronouns, as Mr. Pennebaker calls it in his great book. And that means the hidden, the honest signals. That's another nice book that a colleague of mine, Sandy Pentland, wrote. And then there is the obvious part, which is developing new language. And just think about stockbrokers and bullish and bearish and put and call. It's English, but if you are not in that business, it's not understandable. And what we find when we look at coins, just look at Linux or the World Wide Web, they make up new words. And so the more a group starts inventing and making up new words and using them in their own way, the more creative and innovative the group is. So that's the 3 dimensions that we are exploring and measuring. And now I would like to illustrate them or share a few of the past projects that motivate why we are having those 3 rules and 5 variables. The Eclipse Project, we did that 6 years ago. Eclipse, for the ones who knows Eclipse. Okay, so we have quite a few geeks and programmers among us. Java open source development environment, and that means that all the data is available online, and that means we can measure how quickly teams of open source developers build new components, new modules, new plugins, and in particular they have a database called Bugzilla where they report the software bugs and also report new features. And so what we did here, we measured productivity and creativity of software developers. Productivity was measured speed of fixing bugs. Creativity was measured as speed in implementing new features. And the first insight was quite surprising, had nothing to do with social networks. They are negatively correlated. You can either be creative or productive, but not both. And the interesting thing is that self-perception is different. If you ask them, the software developers, they think they are productive when they are creative, and they are creative when they are productive. But if you look at how they actually work, it's the opposite. At least in this particular project. And the other thing that we found here is that when they are creative, they work in oscillating communication patterns, meaning that they flip back and forth between central network position, peripheral network position, core, periphery, core, periphery. So the more the network structure goes back and forth between a star structure where one person is in the center and sort of a coin structure where everybody talks to everybody, and the more that oscillates, the more creative they are. So that was insight number 1. The next project, and we are studying Wikipedia Inside Out because it's so great as a self-organizing team, and you can analyze the communication structure in many different ways. Here I'm just sharing one particular example, but we are using it for many other things. For example, as a news source. It turns out Wikipedia is faster in creating news than Reuters or Bloomberg. We had one project. It takes Reuters and Bloomberg normally, I think, half an hour or so more than for things to be listed in Wikipedia. The only problem in Wikipedia is finding whether it's a real event or whether somebody was just entering something. But if we just run a crawler and we compare the Reuters event with Wikipedia events, and normally they are faster in Wikipedia. But that's another project. Here we modeled interaction between Wikipedians by their user talk pages. That means when Wikipedians start fighting with each other, it's there for everybody to see. It's on the article talk page. If they have an argument about the page of Barack Obama, everybody can read that argument. And if they have more personal arguments, then they have their own user talk page, which is like a Facebook page. But either way, you can construct a social network like the one that you have here. And at the same time, they are also writing nice things on those pages, which means you can even get a sentiment. How nice are they to each other? And what we measured here is the quality of creative output by the speed of featured articles. How much time does it take from an article on stop level, which means the article page has been created, to being a featured article, which is the highest quality level because Wikipedia articles go through 5 stages. From stop through C, B, A, and then featured article. So what we find here, the more we have centralized leaders, strong leaders, meaning the more this network here is a high between a centrality network with a few people far more central than the others, the faster an article is a featured article. So the more you have those strong centralized leaders, the better for the output. And we have confirmed that result many times. Strong leaders. The last project I would quickly mention is with the social metric badges. That's those little, this thing here is a little bit bigger on the screen, but they are half the size of an iPhone. You wear them around your neck. They have been developed by Sandy Pentland and his graduate students at the Media Lab. And normally everybody in the group wears them, and they measure whether you face each other. It turns out whether you look into the eyes of another person tells a lot. But I'm not getting distracted right now. And then they also measure the energy levels, which for our Crohn's project is very useful because it turns out you can predict flares. Flares are when you get, you will spend your next half day on the bathroom. And the accelerometer will capture those energy levels and will allow you to predict outbreak of a flare beforehand. But we also looked at nurses wearing those badges. And by the way, I found the same thing, central leadership. The more, forget the doctors, an old senior nurse was in charge and sending around the others, the better for the patients. In particular, there we looked at, it's called PACU, Post-Anesthesia Care Unit, at this big hospital in Boston. And our dependent variable was speed of getting out of the PACU and into a normal bed station. And because we had thousands of cases, we could do some interesting statistical analysis. And so what we found is that A, the doctors do not really matter. They are in the center of the discussion, but nobody looks at them. What the more junior nurses do, they look at the senior nurses. The more one senior nurse is in charge, the better. We also looked at programmers, and we also did another project with jazz musicians, where we talked a professional jazz band, not putting the badges around their necks because they jump around too much, but into their pants. And then we could still measure their energy levels. And what we got there is the concept of flow. That means we had a dependent variable, and because the badges have a microphone, dependent variable was strength of the applause. So we could use the same device just to measure how successful they were for each piece they were playing. And it turns out the more their energy levels were swinging in parallel, the stronger the applause. And so you're probably familiar with unpronounceable name Csikszentmihalyi, the concept of flow. And he defines it for individuals, but we try to extend that for groups. And we get a group of jazz musicians, and we have replicated that also with graduate students and doing group works with the badges. And we can see the same thing if they are in flow. Their energy levels, their accelerometers start running in parallel, and the more they are in parallel, the smaller the standard deviation, the higher the quality of their output. And the last thing is that we looked at operational teams of a big Indian outsourcing company through their email. And the dependent variable in this case was something called NPS, Net Promoter Score, which if you're at the business school and in marketing you'll probably know the concept. It's a question that a salesperson asks their customer or marketing or whatever, how likely on a score of 1 to 10 are you to recommend me to a friend? And if the customer says, I'm very likely, you are a promoter. If the customer says, I will never recommend you, you are a detractor. And if you are sort of impartial, you are passive. And so it's a very simple way of measuring customer satisfaction. And we found, again, the same thing, central leadership. But for some other variables here, the creative teams and the operational teams of this Indian outsourcing, they had very different outcomes, in particular for the oscillation. So let me now share with you the results from the C3N project, which I have by now resumed in those 3 rules of collaboration. The first one, and that's not my sentence, Tom Malone, the director of our center, I think, coined that one. In order to gain power, one needs to give away power. So that means delegate leadership, and in creative teams, this oscillation among strong leaders, that's what we found is key. And in the C3N email network, this has very much been confirmed. So the first one, strong leaders. The second one, rotation, oscillating between a centrality, as in the Eclipse project. The third one, variance in contribution index. Contribution measures how much of a sender or a receiver you are. It turns out in creative teams, the more all people contribute the same amount, the better. On the other hand, for ops team, the opposite is true. There are a few people, if they are always continuously strong contributors, for some reason the customers are happier. But right now, and also in our research, what interests us most is creative teams. The next one is the speed of response. I call that ART, average response time, and that is consistently good. Meaning, whether you are an ops team or whether you are creative, it doesn't matter. Happy teams and creative teams and high-performing teams, all of them are more responsive than the others. And the last one, sentiment. And for sentiment, there is no one-size-fits-all. It depends whether you are a creative team, be nice. But also be honest. Honest means if something is bad, say it. So just, you also need to have some strong negative language to say when you are unhappy. And when you are a salesperson for an ops team, then don't use too lot of positive language. That's what we found actually off-putting for the customer. In the case of the C3N teams, we looked at 18 prototypes, and the dependent variable was customer satisfaction, and that in this case was the leaders of the team. That was Peter Magoris, Michael Seid, and the rest of the leadership team, and they were rating how, on those scores, how collaborative presentation, teamwork, and so on, and also creativity, innovativeness of solutions. We tried the same with peer ratings, but it turns out somehow peer ratings and leadership ratings were not, they didn't correlate very well. And it seems that if you are too embedded into your own team, you might become biased. So here you see two teams and their scores. We repeat that process every 3 months, measuring the satisfaction. And here you see a strongly led team at the upper left and a decentralized team at the lower right. And this is all from the mailboxes of the team members, aggregated. And so here you see what is the good and not so good teams. This is the way how we give feedback to them. So it's all, whether it's degree centrality or between a centrality, we get the same insights, comparing it with performance. So those are the different projects, and here we see some which are not doing particularly well. And the next one is rotating leadership, and this means oscillation between fully connected and star structure. And you see at the top a team where you have always the same leader. He's oscillating somewhat, but it's always the same person. At the bottom, you see how the leadership is passed on many, many times. And the beauty is that those sort of variables you can easily extract using the Condor tool from email, and you will always be able to identify who is the central leader. And this again will allow us to point out the teams that have this behavior and the teams that do not have this behavior. The next one is the variance in the contribution index. This has now been applied over 10 years with many different teams. On this axis here, on the x-axis, it's the numbers of, let's think about email, but it doesn't matter whether it's email, social metric badges, blog post, and so on. Sent plus received, that's the x-axis. And the y-axis is how much of a sender you are. If you only send, you're at the top. If you only receive, you are at the bottom. And that means depending on the position, you have very different roles. In particular, we have here this bottleneck. He gets a lot of requests and he never responds. And then you have, I call them nicely, a communicator, but they could also be people that don't matter, because they send that nobody responds to them. So it's not a nice position to be in. And then here you have the most active people, and that's the Peter Margolis, Michael Seitz. So we measure the variance. The next one is the speed of response. And we can again watch a movie and see the most responsive and least responsive people take and just pointing out those things, that's how the beauty of this scheme will change the behavior. If you tell humans how they are being measured, then that's enough to change it. Same with the sentiment. Here we see sentiment of the entire project over time. And we measure, in this case, emotionality of sent email. Sometimes it's also interesting to see emotionality of received emails. You can apply more insights from Pennebaker. I'm not going into details because I notice I'm slowly running out of time. And so the more you speak about yourself, the less secure you are, for example. But on the other hand, the more you speak about yourself, the more you are willing to open yourself up to criticism. So there is, using many I words has different meanings depending on the context. But we can again point that out. And in the case of the sentiment and combining that with other insights, I call that only say something when you have something to say. For example, when we use the social metric badges, what we found, and we looked at trust inside small team settings, what we found is the more people are looked at and the less they speak, the more they are trusted. And so with that, I stop speaking. But put up, this is our team, which is quite sizable, and this is the most recent 3 books that describe all of those things that I have been racing through in more detail. Thank you very much.
So, what advice would you give an academic in terms of creating a team and managing leadership of various papers based on your findings around creativity and productivity?
Well, they might sound somewhat trivial in that it's empowerment. It's delegating leadership, trying to make them owners of the problem. And one of my favorite role models I mean, it's all about humility, about putting your own ego in the background, and those are things which are easily said, but they are quite hard to live. And if you measure them in in email, they come out. One of my other principles, but this is very easy to say again, but very hard to do. When I recruit student labor, I do not pay them initially, which means it's slower to build a team, but I can be sure they are intrinsically motivated.
I may have missed it in the presentation, or correct me if I did, but how do you account for quality? And what are your thoughts on quality? You're talking about strong leaders and speed of productivity, speed of performance, but how do you account for quality in thinking about creativity and the performance of these teams?
I think quality is always part. When we look at commercial settings, quality is very easy. It's dollars. In the end, you always have money. Money as, and in money you have all the things, innovation, you have how good you are in selling your stuff, and so on. When you are in academia, you can say it's peer rating, but just creativity for the sake of creativity for me is never enough.
But if I could follow up, thinking about the Wikipedia example, I'm fascinated by the notion that a single editor would produce an article more quickly, that get that article to the front page faster. But is that necessarily an article, a news article, or content that's going to be of high quality? And you could make an argument that if we're talking news, talking information, quality would matter, and going through that deliberative process of having people co-edit, critique work to produce a high-quality article could be important. So maybe in that Wikipedia example, that's where quality could make a difference.
Well,
I'm just curious.
yes, there is, depending on the subject matter, the huge difference in editing structure. Country pages, I think Australia has 4,000 editors. The page Mozart in Italy has 16 editors. And Mozart in Italy made it to featured article much faster than Australia, because the coordination problem of 4,000 people is so huge. And then everybody who has ever been there feels they need to go and contribute. They have nothing to say, but they say it anyway. And then it gets a really slow process. On the other hand, you get the world's leading experts on Mozart in Italy, and they just get together and they write the article, and it's much faster. And I guess the reason, even when you look at the Australia article, or the one I was showing was a history article about the Spartan Athenic wars. It was 2 or 3 people that did 90% of the edit. And they had to undo, probably without trying to offend them too much, the edits of the hundreds and so on that were contributing the others. So, strong leaders. Intrinsically motivated, unpaid strong leaders.
Can you just clarify how you measure
That was it was like with the iPhones when you play the accelerometer, which measures the change in x, y, z coordinates
Okay, so
over
it's
time.
moving around.
Moving around, and then it's a physical formula how you convert it into energy.